given to a Viking for her flaws. He loved her as no Christian noble ever dreamed. The granite walls wept ice, slick and unforgiving. Jarl Thorgil stood on the parapet, the wind a wolf's howl tearing at his cloak. Below, the gray sea gnawed at the cliffs, a constant hungry sound. He was lord here, master of stone and snow, but the throne felt like a tomb. Power was a cold weight, solitude a gnawing ache, his life the taste of salt and fear, the smell of turf smoke thick in the longhouse, the clang of steel. Men were tools, women burdens or temporary comforts, simple, brutal, real. Then she came, a ship, a pale flag of truce against the horizon. Aethelred, English, a lady, offered as tribute, a sacrifice. Her own people called her flawed, a strong spirit in a world that demanded obedience, a scar, a jagged, angry line marring porcelain skin. The whispers followed her like the wind. Defective. He watched her disembark, small against the looming figures of his warriors. She met his gaze not with terror, but defiance. Curiosity, sharp and unexpected, pierced the Jarl's hardened shell. He saw the scar. His breath caught. Not pity, not disgust, something else. A strange recognition, a flicker. Impossible. He stared, the mark drawing him in, a mystery etched in flesh. What was this feeling? He leaned closer, trying to decipher the impossible connection. Antes de continuarmos com essa história incrível, preciso te fazer alerta importante. Muitos inscritos têm relatado que o YouTube removeu suas inscrições sem aviso. Dá só uma conferida rápida no botão vermelho aí embaixo para garantir que você ainda está inscrito no canal. Não quero que você perca nenhum conteúdo exclusivo que vem por aí. E já que você está aí, deixa aquele like poderoso que me ajuda muito com o algoritmo. E me conta nos comentários, de qual cidade você está assistindo? Adoro conhecer cada pessoa incrível que faz parte dessa comunidade. Sua participação faz toda a diferença. Vamos interagir. The sound ripped through the air, not the sea's drone, not the wind's lament. A horn, long, deep, a beast bellowing across the fjord. Warhorn. Thorgil snapped his head up, the strange moment with the Englishwoman shattering like ice under a hammer. The horn's cry was unmistakable. An unexpected arrival. Danger. The fragile peace, bartered with blood and tribute, was already threatened. His hand instinctively went to the axe haft at his belt. His eyes, moments ago fixed on a woman's face, scanned the distant water, searching for the shape that brought such a sound. The fortress stirred. Warriors emerged. The air, already sharp with cold, now tasted of impending conflict. Thorgil stood, torn. The mystery of the scarred woman, the inexplicable pull he felt, wrestled with the primal call to arms. He had to confront the encroaching shadow of war. And somehow, in the heart of that shadow, he knew he would have to confront her. And the unnerving truth hidden behind a single, defiant scar. The saga had just begun. His gaze, ripped from the gray horizon by a guttural shout from below, landed back on her. Ethelred, still small against the backdrop of surging Vikings, her chin still held high, though the defiance flickered, replaced by a stark, wide-eyed fear as the reality of the war horn sank in. The scar. His eyes locked onto it again, drawn by that same impossible magnetic force. But this time, with the smell of fear and steel rising around him, the image in his mind wasn't hers alone. It was a ghost made flesh, a memory, sharp and bloody as a fresh axe cut, exploded behind his eyes. Hjalmar, his brother, falling, blood blooming on the snow. A shield maiden, massive and grim, standing over the body. And on her face, a mark. Not a wound, not a battle scar accidentally earned. A deliberate, cruel design carved into the skin. A jagged line, precisely like the one marring Aethelred's cheek. Exactly. The same shape, the same stark white against flushed skin. No, it couldn't be. The roar of his huskarls scrambling for arms, the clang of mail shirts, the heavy thud of boots on stone, it all faded to a dull roar. The world narrowed to that single, horrifying line on the Englishwoman's face. The killer of Hjalmar, the woman who carved out a piece of Thorgil's very soul, was named Astrid. A legend of the Shield Isles. Vanished dead, or so they said. But that mark, that was her sigil, her claim, her brand on the world. And this fragile, foreign woman, delivered here as tribute, bore it as if it were her own. Ethelred, the English noblewoman? No, it was impossible. A cruel trick of the light. A mind strained by sleepless nights and the constant gnaw of command, conjuring demons. But the vision held, unwavering. The scar on Ethelred. The scar on Astrid. Identical. A cold, terrible certainty seeped into his bones. Colder than the stone beneath his feet. Colder than the sea he now had to face. Why would the English brand one of their own with a Viking killer's mark? Why would she have it? Was she kin to Astrid? A descendant carrying the shame or the twisted pride of that legacy? Or was this tribute a calculated insult, a poisoned gift delivered to mock his loss? Had he welcomed the mark of his deepest pain, the face of his brother's killer, into his very home? The horn blared again, closer now, a physical shock dragging him back to the present horror. A ship, a threat on the waves, and a threat standing mere yards away. A living embodiment of a nightmare he thought buried forever with his brother's bones. Rage, cold and absolute, replaced the strange curiosity, the inexplicable pull twisting into something vile, dangerous. He had to confront the ship. He had to prepare for battle. But how could he lead? How could he think when this woman, this walking reminder of his greatest loss, stood watching him, her scar a silent scream of impossible truth? The air grew thick with the scent of brine and blood not yet spilled, but promised. His hand tightened on the axe haft until his knuckles ached, until the wood groaned slightly. The saga hadn't just begun. It had just become a curse twisted by fate itself. His hand, white-knuckled on the axe haft, trembled with the force of contained fury. Rage, sharp as a spear point, lanced through him, burning away the confusion, the strange pull, leaving only the raw, bleeding wound of memory. Astrid, Hjalmar, and this woman bearing the mark. A mockery, a poison. He snarled, a low guttural sound swallowed by the rising clamor of the fortress. To arms! The shout ripped from his throat, raw and thunderous. Shields, axes, on the walls! The Vikings surged, a wave of iron and muscle, the longhouse emptying, the courtyards filling with the din of hurried preparation. Mail shirts scraped, axes rang on whetstones, shields were hoisted onto shoulders. Faces were grim, eyes sharp with the ancient, thrilling dread of battle. But Thorgil's gaze, even as he barked orders, kept snapping back to her. Ethelred, small, pale, a fragile knot of terror in the storm of armed men. And the scar, always the scar, a siren song of pain and vengeance. The horn sounded again, closer now, its cry a death knell. He spun, wrenching his eyes from the woman. The ship was clearer now, a dark shape against the churning gray. Long, lean, low in the water. Not a merchant vessel, not a simple raider. This was a warship, faster than his own longships. A predator. He squinted, scanning the deck as it cut through the waves with impossible speed. Shapes moved upon it. Warriors, too many for a casual attack. And then he saw it. On the prow, a standard snapping in the brutal wind. Black. A white wolf, snarling, the banner of the Shield Isles. And standing beneath it, a figure. Tall, armored, unmistakable, even from this distance. A helm shaped like a raven's head. A massive axe clutched in one hand. Astrid. The world tilted. Not dead. She wasn't dead. The legend was false. She lived. She sailed. And she was coming here. Coming for him? For his land? The rage a moment ago focused on the woman beside him, twisted, became something colder. A terror so profound it stole the air from his lungs. But his eyes, in that moment of absolute shock, flickered back to Ethelred. And the woman, watching the approaching ship, let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure, abject horror that tore through the battle-ready noise. Her hands flew to her face, covering the scarred cheek as if to hide it, to make the impossible visible mark vanish. And in that gesture, in that raw, terrified sound, the true, devastating truth slammed into Thorgil like a battering ram. The scar wasn't Astrid's sigil. It wasn't a mark she wore. It was a mark she gave. A trophy. A brand. He had seen that look before, on the few others who had survived an encounter with the Shield Wolf and lived to tell it. Scarred not in battle, but by her blade afterwards. Ethelred wasn't Astrid. She wasn't Astrid's kin. She was a victim of Astrid, sent here, unknowingly, bearing the very mark of the monster sailing towards them. He hadn't brought the killer's sigil into his home. He had brought a piece of her prey, and the hunter had just arrived to claim her. The ship was closer. The raven helm glinted. Astrid was home, and the saga hadn't just become a curse. It had become a blood feud, written in scars and salt. Salt. The air thickened, tasting of brine and impending slaughter. The horn wailed again, a hungry sound that scraped along Thorgil's nerves. Astrid. She wasn't a ghost story, whispered in the dark corners of the longhouse, a shadow conjured by fear. She was wood and sail and steel, a black wolf slicing through the gray waves. And she was coming here. Thorgil's gaze ripped from the warship, pulled by an invisible chain, forged in blood and memory, and slammed onto Ethelred. Still rooted to the stone, small against the surging forms of his warriors, her hands pressed flat against her cheek, the jagged line hidden, but burning like a brand in his mind's eye. Her breath hitched, a tiny, fragile sound, lost in the rising roar of his fort, preparing for battle. But then, he saw it, as the ship drove closer, faster than any vessel he'd seen. A predatory shark cutting through the sea, as the raven helm on the prow became clearer, sharp and cruel. Ethelred's eyes didn't just hold terror. The stark English fear was still there. Yes, a pale wash of dread. But something else had bled into them, a terrible, ancient understanding. A resignation that went bone deep, colder than the ice on the parapet. And beneath her hand, where the scar lay hidden, where the skin should have been smooth porcelain, he saw the faintest flicker, not of light reflecting from the steel below, of movement. A subtle ripple beneath the skin, a pulse, a knot tightening, as if the scar itself was not merely etched onto her flesh, but woven into her very being, a part of muscle and bone bound to her soul, as if it pulsed with a dark, resonant life tied directly to the approaching ship. Ethelred lowered her hands slowly. Her eyes, still wide, were no longer fixed on the approach. The terror hadn't vanished, but a chilling acceptance, a terrible shared secret, now swam in their depths. It was the look of someone facing an inevitable tide. The jagged line on her cheek seemed to deepen, to darken against the sudden pallor of her skin, standing out with sickening clarity. It wasn't just a scar of survival. It was a sigil of binding. A claim, yes, but not on her life. On her will. Astrid didn't mark her victims for sport, for memory, for simple trophies of battle. She marked her anchors, living links, survivors of her blade who carried a piece of her command within them, sent out into the world, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps not, waiting for the call, waiting for the signal. And the Raven ship, tearing through the waves with impossible speed, was not just a raiding party come for plunder. It was the sound of the anchor being raised, the chain being tightened. Ethelred hadn't been sent here as tribute by frightened Englishmen. She had been delivered, planted, a poisoned seed bearing the very mark of his nemesis, ready to bloom destruction within his walls. Her fear wasn't just for herself, for the coming slaughter. It was for what she was about to become. For what the scar, the ancient magic perhaps woven into the very ink-dark line, compelled her to do when Astrid was near. When the link was forged anew, he saw it in her eyes, a flicker of something steel-hard beneath the panic, a terrible, dawning knowledge that mirrored his own horror. A Viking killer's mark on an English noblewoman. Not a trophy of battle. Not a wound survived. A key. And the lock was his fortress. The ship was nearly upon them now, the figures on deck becoming distinct, terrifying. The heavy thud of boots on stone, the shout of orders, the clang of steel, it all faded. The horn screamed again, a triumphant, predatory sound that spoke of imminent boarding. But the loudest sound, the most terrifying, was the silence in Thorgil's mind as the full, devastating horror unfolded. He hadn't just welcomed a marked woman bearing a painful reminder of his loss. He had welcomed the first wave of Astrid's invasion, walking right through his supposedly impenetrable gates, a living weapon waiting activation. And she was already inside the walls. His breath hitched in his throat, tasting not of salt and fear, but of betrayal and inevitable ash. The blood feud wasn't just outside, crashing. The Saga had just become a nightmare, from which there was no waking. No waking. The salt air clawed at Thorgil's throat. The horizon was a jagged line of gray sea meeting gray sky, broken only by the black scar of Astrid's longship. The raven helm glinted, closer now, its cruel shape clear. The roar of his warriors preparing for war was a physical force, shaking the stone beneath his feet. The clang of steel, the rasp of mail, the guttural shouts. Yet it all felt distant, muffled by the drum of blood in his ears, by the singular focus of his terror on the woman standing mere yards away. Ethelred. Her hands were still pressed to her cheek, a futile gesture against a truth etched deeper than skin. Her eyes, moments ago wide with English dread, were changing. The pale wash of terror was fading, replaced by a terrifying emptiness. Not a void, but a stillness. A predator's calm, settling over prey that had accepted its fate. Or perhaps was no longer prey at all. He watched, frozen, as her hands slowly, deliberately, fell from her face. The scar stood out starkly against her pale skin, a violent red, now bleeding into the jagged white, pulsing with a faint, sickening light from within. The movement beneath the skin he'd glimpsed before wasn't a ripple, it was a coil, a tightening, like a snake waking, or a knot being pulled taut. Her head tilted, not towards the approaching ship, not towards the chaos of the fort, but upwards, as if listening to a sound only she could hear, carried on the wind. Then she smiled. It wasn't the forced pleasantry of a noblewoman, nor the brave defiance he'd seen on her arrival. It was a smile utterly alien, devoid of warmth, ancient and terrible. Her eyes, once the soft blue of a northern sky, were now hard as flint, reflecting the cold gray light of the sea. And as Astrid's ship grated against the rocks below, the shout of grapple hooks tearing through the air, Ethelred raised her hand, not to shield herself, but as if in greeting. And from her throat, not the fragile English words, but a low, resonant sound, a note struck from deep within the earth, echoed the war horn's call. It was a sound Thorgil knew from the deepest, most primal corners of his nightmares, a battle cry. But it wasn't Astrid's. His breath hitched, turning to ice in his lungs. The scar didn't just bind her will. It didn't just mark her as a victim. It was a conduit, a key. And Astrid hadn't sent an anchor. She had sent a shield, a weapon. And as the first of Astrid's warriors swarmed over the parapet below, meeting the desperate defense of Thorgil's huskarls, Ethelred moved. Not with the awkward grace of a lady, but with the fluid, deadly speed of a seasoned killer. Her eyes, now locked on his, held a chilling recognition. Not of him, Thorgil the Jarl, but of him, the obstacle. She wasn't Aethelred, the tribute. She wasn't even just Aethelred, the marked victim. She was Aethelred. The activated blade. The smile remained, a cruel twist of lips that had only hours ago trembled with fear. The horror wasn't outside his walls, crashing against his defenses. It had woken inside them. And the shield wolf wasn't alone. The saga hadn't just become a blood feud. It had become a betrayal, written in the very heart of his supposed sanctuary. Unleashed by a woman he had mistakenly seen as prey. Prey. Her small, pale form, moments ago a fragile vessel for fear, straightened with impossible rigidity. The foreign noblewoman melted away, replaced by something ancient and utterly lethal. Her eyes, no longer soft blue, burned with the flat, unseeing intensity of a hawk. And then she moved, not a lady's stumble, not a warrior's practiced stance, a fluidity like water, a speed that stole the air. She was a blur of gray linen against the rough wool of his guards, closing the distance between them with unnatural grace. Thorgil, caught in the gut punch of revelation, barely raised his axe in time. The steel met empty air. She was past him, already engaging the Huskarls who moments before had been preparing to meet Astrid's charge. The clang of her attack wasn't steel on steel. It was a sharp, cracking sound, like bone breaking. A Huskarl, a man whose shield arm had turned aside countless blades, crumpled without a sound, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. Another moved to intercept, axe raised, but Ethelred was a wraith. She ducked under his swing, not with skill, but with a terrifying, effortless shift of mass, and her hand, the one that had just hidden the scar, lashed out, not with a weapon, but with fingers curled into claws, striking the man's chest. His mail shirt offered no defense. He recoiled, a strangled gasp tearing from his lips, falling back against the parapet wall as if struck by a battering ram. Thorgil felt a cold dread bloom in his gut, colder than the wind. This wasn't the controlled rage of a shield wolf. This was something else, something unbound. His eyes, scanning the impossible tableau of her silent, deadly ballet among his own men, flickered back to her face. The smile was gone, replaced by that horrifying emptiness. And the scar, it pulsed now, not just with color, but with a faint, unnatural light, a cold white glow against the pallor of her skin, the jagged lines seeming to writhe, alive. Astrid's men were swarming the walls below, their shouts and the ring of steel echoing up. His men were split, some facing the invaders, others turning in bewildered horror to face this sudden, monstrous threat in their midst. Chaos. Perfect, devastating chaos. Thorgil roared, shaking off the paralysis of shock. "Hold the walls! Stop the woman!" He lunged towards her, his axe a silver blur. She turned, her eyes locking onto his with that same chilling, inhuman focus. She didn't wield a sword, a spear, or a shield. She met his charge with empty hands, the glowing scar a beacon of unnatural power. Just as his axe blade sang towards her head, she raised her arm, not to block, but to meet the strike with her forearm. The metal shrieked, scraping against, not bone, not flesh, but something that gave with a horrible, resilient twang, deflecting the blow upwards, sending vibrations that numbed Thorgil's arm to the shoulder. Impossible. No human bone could withstand that. No shield, not even iron-bound oak, could deflect a fueled axe blow like that. His eyes snapped to her arm, protected by nothing but skin and the thin fabric of her gown. There, mirroring the jagged line on her cheek, a faint tracery of glowing white lines appeared, pulsing just beneath the skin of her forearm. Like glowing veins, momentarily visible before fading back into the flesh. The scar wasn't just a mark. It was a source, not of control, not of victimhood, but of a terrible, ancient strength woven into her very being. And in that moment, as Astrid's first wave broke onto his walls, and Ethelred, the marked woman, deflected his killing blow with her bare arm, Thorgil knew the devastating truth. Astrid hadn't just sent an anchor or a weapon. She had unleashed something far older, far more terrifying. The scar wasn't Astrid's sigil, wasn't her trophy. It was the mark of a power she couldn't control, maybe couldn't even replicate. A power dormant until now, until the proximity of Astrid's own dark energy, or perhaps the scent of the ancient blood feud between their houses, had ripped Ethelred's English fragility apart and woken the true. It was the shattering dawn of something that would drown their world in blood and light. Blood. The air crackled, not just with the shriek of steel below, but with a cold, unnatural energy emanating from the woman before him. Thorgil's axe arm screamed, useless for a moment, numb from the impossible deflection. Ethelred smiled again, a terrible, knowing twist of lips, her eyes fixed on his with a chilling, predatory calm. The glowing scar on her cheek pulsed brighter, mirroring the faint, writhing lines beneath the skin of her forearm. This wasn't mere strength. This was something else, something ancient. His mind, even as he lunged again, axe held awkwardly in his other hand, was a storm of chaos. Astrid's men swarmed the walls. His own warriors fought bravely below, but also faltered, glancing back in bewildered terror at the impossible figure moving among them. Ethelred danced through their clumsy attempts to contain her, a whisper of deadly motion. Another Huskarl fell, not to steel, but to a chillingly precise strike that left no outward wound, only death twisted into their features. As Thorgil pressed his attack, forcing her back towards the parapet edge, the light from her scar intensified, casting flickering, unholy shadows on the stone. The shape, that jagged line, it wasn't just a random mark. It wasn't the simple slash of a blade. As he watched it pulse, felt the raw power beating against his own will like a storm tide against a cliff, a memory, buried deep beneath layers of battle and grief, tore itself free. A forgotten saga, whispered around a fire long ago, dismissed as myth. A symbol etched into the oldest, dustiest section of the clan hall. A warn. Not the wolf. The serpent. The jagged line wasn't Astrid's trophy. It was a coiled serpent, stylized, ancient, the sigil of the House of the Serpent, sworn enemies of the Raven clan since the dawn of their lineage, wiped from the sagas, thought utterly destroyed centuries past, and the power radiating from Ethelred. That was their power. Dormant, waiting, his axe strike, fueled by this new, devastating horror, was a blur. She met it again with her bare arm, the glowing serpent mark flaring, the resilient twang echoing the ancient sound of steel against scale in the old tales. But this time, as the force slammed back at him, Thorgil saw it clearly. Not just lines, a pattern. The coiled serpent burning white beneath her skin. Ethelred wasn't just a marked victim of Astrid. She wasn't just an activated weapon. She was a descendant, a living vessel. And Astrid hadn't marked her. Astrid hadn't awakened her. Astrid, the shield wolf, descendant of the raven's oldest enemy, had simply brought the serpent back to its den. The tribute wasn't prey. She was the ancient venom brought into the heart of his fortress, a walking curse delivered by the very hand of the blood feud itself. Her eyes, alight with that terrible ancient glow, locked onto his. The chilling smile returned. It wasn't Ethelred facing him. It was something that had slept for centuries, wearing her skin like a cloak, and it was home. The ship's horns screamed below, Astrid's warriors pouring over the walls. But the true battle, the ancient, horrifying conflict, was already inside. Thorgil's saga had not just become a curse, it had become the final, impossible stand against a nightmare older than memory, risen from the grave in the face of a woman he had almost pitied, marked with the sigil of an enemy fought long dead, and the serpent had just shown its fangs. Fangs. The ancient symbol burned on Ethelred's cheek, a beacon of unleashed power. Thorgil stumbled back, axe heavy, useless against the impossibility of her defense. The air crackled, thick with the salt spray from the crashing waves below, and the raw, unsettling energy radiating from her. His Huskarls, caught between the invading raven warriors, swarming the outer walls, and this silent, deadly storm in their midst, fell back in bewildered horror. Ethelred moved, a liquid shadow weaving through their ranks. A hand, impossibly fast, lashed out, not touching, but the air around a warrior's head shrieked, and he dropped, eyes wide and unseeing, as if his life force had been simply torn from him. This wasn't battle. This was reaping. Thorgil raised his axe again, the instinct ancient, but his mind raced. The serpent, her power, Astrid sailing towards him, the raven banner, a dark promise of death. But Ethelred's eyes, they held that terrible ancient light, a connection to something far deeper than a simple blood feud. The screams of battle rose from below as Astrid's men gained purchase on the outer ramparts. The horn from the approaching longship blared again, a triumphant cry just beyond the cliffs. Ethelred turned her head at the sound, her gaze fixing on the dark shape cutting through the waves. The chilling smile returned, wider now, predatory. It held no fear, no terror, only a terrible, knowing anticipation. Then she spoke, not in the soft lilt of English that had fooled them all. The sound that emerged was a low, guttural resonance, ancient and harsh, a tongue Thorgil hadn't heard spoken aloud in centuries, save in the forbidden sagas of the Serpent Clan. It was Norse, yes, but twisted, primal. You thought you saw a victim, Raven. The voice rasped, a sound like stone grinding on bone. Utterly alien, yet horribly familiar. A broken thing, marked by the monster. Her eyes, alight with the serpent's glow, locked back onto Thorgil. The movement beneath the scar intensified, a sickening pulse. You looked for the shield wolf out there on the waves. She gestured towards the approaching ship with a hand that had just deflected his axe. The smile stretched, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too white in the pale light. The air grew colder, the serpent mark on her cheek pulsing with blinding intensity. But Astrid does not hide on ships. Thorgil's blood ran to ice. His breath hitched, a strangled gasp. No, it couldn't be. The legends, the massive shield maiden, the killer of Hjalmar. Her form seemed to shimmer for a heartbeat, the fragile English frame hardening, the presence swelling with immense ancient power. Her voice, though still Ethelred's size, filled the air, echoing the clash of steel and the war horns, a sound that tore through bone and soul. "I am Astrid," the voice declared, flat and terrible, devoid of mercy, laden with centuries of hate. The serpent's scale, the shield wolf, the serpent's sigil on her cheek, flared one final time, blinding white against the sudden, horrifying transformation of her features. It wasn't a scar. It was a mask, a binding, a source of power. And the fragile Englishwoman, the tribute, the prey, was gone. Only the monster remained. Thorgil stood, frozen, the axe slipping in his numb hand. The killer of his brother was not just inside his walls. She wore the face he had felt a strange pull towards, wielded the power he had just witnessed, and had come home not just to conquer, but to personally shatter him. The saga hadn't just become a nightmare. It had become a cruel jest spun by the Norns themselves, etching betrayal onto the very face of vengeance. Vengeance. The name Astrid hung in the air, a physical weight heavier than any mail shirt, crushing the breath from Thorgil's lungs. He stared at the woman. No, the monster before him. Ethelred was gone, swallowed by the ancient power that pulsed beneath the serpent mark. The face of his brother's killer. Here, inside his walls, his sanctuary. Rage pure and blinding warred with a soul-deep terror. He raised his axe, its weight suddenly foreign in his hand. Kill her. The primal urge screamed in his blood. But the power radiating from her, it was wrong. It was unnatural. She smiled, a slow spreading twist of lips that promised exquisite pain. The glowing serpent mark on her cheek pulsed, brighter now, casting unholy light across the stone. Her eyes, twin points of ancient, terrible light, were fixed on his, dissecting him, finding the deepest wound. "Kill me, little raven." Her voice was a rasp, the sound of a glacier grinding stone. You buried your grief. You thought it ended with your brother's bones. Below, the roar of battle intensified. Astrid's men, raven warriors, were climbing the walls, meeting the desperate defense of Thorgil's surprised huskarls. Steel rang, shields splintered, cries of pain ripped through the air. But on the parapet where Thorgil stood, the true horror was this stillness, this ancient power unleashed inches away. Ethelred, Astrid, didn't move towards him. Her gaze flickered past his shoulder, towards the ship now nudging the rocks below. The raven helm on the prow glinted. The figure beneath it was clearer now, a massive shape clad in dark, imposing armor. And Thorgil, his mind shattered by the impossible truth before him, felt a new, cold dread seep into his bones. That figure, something about the way they stood. Astrid on the parapet laughed, a sound like cracking ice. "Did you wonder, little raven, why I sent you such a delicate gift?" Her hand, the one that had deflected his axe, gestured towards the ship. She was merely the cage, the key. The figure on the prow of the longship raised their massive axe, not in a war cry, but in a slow, deliberate salute. And in that gesture, in the precise angle of the blade, the familiar tilt of the head beneath the raven helm, Thorgil's blood turned to ice. His brother, Hjalmar. It couldn't be. He had watched him fall, blood staining the snow. Astrid had stood over his body. But the figure on the ship was Hjalmar. Older, harder, clad in armor that seemed woven from shadow and dread. And as the raven ship secured its grapple hooks, drawing closer to the cliffs, Hjalmar raised his other hand. Not a gauntleted fist, but a bare hand, palm outward. And on his forearm, pulsing with a faint, sickening white light, was the unmistakable, jagged symbol of the serpent. Astrid's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed to gleam in the unnatural light. "You mourned a dead brother," she rasped, the serpent mark on her face burning. "I give you one returned. Bound, yes. Changed, most certainly." Her voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "But he is Astrid's now. A gift, Raven. From my house to yours. A blood debt paid in the most delicious coin." Thorgil's axe clattered on the stone. Forgotten. His brother. Alive. But bound to the ancient enemy. A weapon wielded by the very monster who had supposedly slain him. The horror of Ethelred's transformation paled against this impossible, gut-wrenching betrayal. The serpent had not just invaded his home. It had twisted his deepest loss into its sharpest fang. He stood on the parapet, the sound of battle a distant roar, the chilling laughter of Astrid echoing in his ears, staring at the ship below where his dead brother stood, wearing the mark of his killer. The Saga wasn't a curse. It was a tomb, and he was already sealed inside with the ghosts he thought he'd buried. Vengeance. The name Astrid hung in the air, a physical weight heavier than any mail shirt, crushing the breath from Thorgil's lungs. He stared at the woman. No, the monster before him. Aethelred was gone, swallowed by the ancient power that pulsed beneath the serpent mark. The face of his brother's killer, here, inside his walls, his sanctuary. Rage, pure and blinding, warred with a soul-deep terror. He raised his axe, its weight suddenly foreign in his hand. Kill her. The primal urge screamed in his blood. But the power radiating from her, it was wrong. It was unnatural. She smiled, a slow, spreading twist of lips that promised exquisite pain. The glowing serpent mark on her cheek pulsed, brighter now, casting unholy light across the stone. Her eyes, twin points of ancient, terrible light, were fixed on his, dissecting him, finding the deepest wound. "Kill me, little raven?" Her voice was a rasp, the sound of a glacier grinding stone. "You buried your grief. You thought it ended with your brother's bones." Below, the roar of battle intensified. Astrid's men, raven warriors, were climbing the walls, meeting the desperate defense of Thorgil's surprised huskarls. Steel rang, shields splintered, cries of pain ripped through the air. But on the parapet where Thorgil stood, the true horror was this stillness, this ancient power unleashed inches away. Ethelred, Astrid, didn't move towards him. Her gaze flickered past his shoulder, towards the ship now nudging the rocks below. The raven helm on the prow glinted. The figure beneath it was clearer now, a massive shape clad in dark, imposing armor. And Thorgil, his mind shattered by the impossible truth before him, felt a new cold dread seep into his bones. That figure, something about the way they stood. Astrid on the parapet laughed, a sound like cracking ice. "Did you wonder, little raven, why I sent you such a delicate gift?" Her hand, the one that had deflected his axe, gestured towards the ship. She was merely the cage, the key. The figure on the prow of the longship raised their massive axe, not in a war cry, but in a slow, deliberate salute. And in that gesture, in the precise angle of the blade, the familiar tilt of the head beneath the raven helm, Thorgil's blood turned to ice. His brother, Hjalmar, it couldn't be. He had watched him fall, blood staining the snow. Astrid had stood over his body. But the figure on the ship was Hjalmar, older, harder, clad in armor that seemed woven from shadow and dread. And as the raven ship secured its grapple hooks, drawing closer to the cliffs, Hjalmar raised his other hand. Not a gauntleted fist, but a bare hand, palm outward. And on his forearm, pulsing with a faint, sickening white light, was the unmistakable, jagged symbol of the serpent. Astrid's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed to gleam in the unnatural light. "You mourned a dead brother?" she rasped, the serpent mark on her face burning. "I give you one returned. Bound, yes. Changed most certainly." Her voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "But he is Astrid's now, a gift, raven. From my house to yours, a blood debt paid in the most delicious coin." Thorgil's axe clattered on the stone, forgotten. His brother, alive, but bound to the ancient enemy, a weapon wielded by the very monster who had supposedly slain him. The horror of Aethelred's transformation paled against this impossible, gut-wrenching betrayal. The serpent had not just invaded his home, it had twisted his deepest loss into its sharpest fang. He stood on the parapet. The sound of battle, a distant roar. The chilling laughter of Astrid echoing in his ears. Staring at the ship below where his dead brother stood, wearing the mark of his killer. The Saga wasn't a curse. It was a tomb, and he was already sealed inside with the ghosts he thought he'd buried. but buried. The ancient voice, Astrid's voice, using Ethelred's transformed form, echoed the terrible truth across the parapet. Hjalmar, alive, bound to the Serpent clan, a walking wound sent to shatter Thorgil. Rage and grief twisted into a knot of ice in the Jarl's gut. Below, the clatter of steel rose as Astrid's warriors scaled the walls, the defenders fighting valiantly. But the heart of the fort was already compromised. The air thrummed with the raw power radiating from the serpent mark on Astrid Ethelred's face, and the fainter, mirroring glow on Hjalmar's arm below. Thorgil looked at the woman who was no longer Ethelred, at the face of his nemesis, wearing the skin of the tribute. Her smile was a cruel twist of triumph. Then his gaze locked onto Hjalmar on the ship, his brother's form warped by shadow and the serpent's sigil. He saw not just the killer's prize, but the ghost of the man he remembered, standing silent witness to the ancient hate made flesh. Something shifted in Thorgil's soul, not the primal need for vengeance, but a deeper, colder resolve forged in the furnace of impossible loss. The blood feud, the ancient prophecy of the serpent returning, it wasn't just about death and power. It was about binding, about twisting life into a mockery of what it was. Hjalmar was the proof. Astrid laughed again, a sound of pure ancient malice. Come, little raven, embrace the end your bloodline built. She raised a hand, the serpent mark on her cheek pulsing brighter still, and the light on Hjalmar's arm flared in response. Thorgil felt the air grow heavier, as if the serpent power was about to consume them all. But as the light intensified, Astrid Ethelred stumbled. The terrible smile faltered for a heartbeat. For a fleeting second, a flicker of something else. Pain? Resistance? Crossed the transformed features. The serpent power was immense, ancient, but perhaps its vessel was not as completely subsumed as Astrid believed. Ethelred's fear, defiance, her very humanity might have been a fragile cage, but perhaps it had left a mark, too. Thorgil saw his chance, not to kill Astrid, not to reclaim Hjalmar, but to sever the link, to break the ancient chain. His axe was useless against the serpent's strength. His warriors were needed on the walls. His eyes darted to the parapet edge, then to the ship. With a roar that tore his throat, Thorgil didn't lunge at Astrid. He turned and threw himself over the parapet edge, aiming for the rocks and the ship below. The serpent power shrieked, sensing the disruption of the link. Astrid Ethelred cried out, not in triumph, but in sudden, raw fury. Her hand lashing out not at Thorgil, but towards Hjalmar, as if to tighten the bond. The fall was a blur of wind and stone. He hit the icy rocks with brutal force, the world exploding in pain. Below, the ship's grapple hooks were fast, the gap closing. He crawled, bleeding, towards the longship, towards his brother. He reached the hull just as the ship ground against the stone. Hjalmar stood on the prow, his face a mask of ancient power and chilling emptiness. The serpent mark on his arm pulsed, mirroring the raging power from the parapet above. Thorgil, battered and broken, reached out with a bloody hand, not for a weapon, but for his brother's marked arm. "Hjalmar," he choked out. his voice raw. "Break free. The feud ends with us." His hand closed on Hjalmar's forearm, covering the glowing serpent mark. Pain, cold and searing, lanced up his arm, straight to his soul. The power fought him, ancient and malevolent. On the parapet, Astrid Athelred screamed, a sound of frustrated rage and shattering magic. The light on her face pulsed violently. Then, with a sound like cracking bone, flickered and died, taking the terrible glow from Hjalmar's arm with it. The connection was severed. The ancient conduit was broken. Ethelred fell to the stone above, her form shrinking, losing the terrible power, leaving only a small, crumpled figure marked by a dark, lifeless line. On the ship, Hjalmar's eyes widened, the ancient light fading, replaced by a slow, dawning horror as he looked at the serpent mark on his arm, at Thorgil's bleeding form, and at the battle raging around them. The silence on the parapet was absolute. Below, the battle faltered, raven warriors looking confusedly towards their commander, who was no longer powered by ancient magic. Thorgil lay on the rocks, the serpent's cold searing him, but the link was broken. The debt was paid, not in blood spilled on the snow, but in a power unbound and then contained at terrible cost. The serpent house's return was thwarted, the ancient magic of binding severed by a desperate act of brotherly love and a foreign woman's accidental sacrifice. Astrid the Shield-Wolf was trapped. Her pout Hjalmar would carry the scar, a constant reminder of the forces that sought to claim them. Ethelred would be remembered not as prey, but as the unwitting key and the broken lock. The saga had reached its bitter, hard-won end. Se esta saga tocou sua alma, então escute o chamado do Skald. A nossa jornada depende da força do nosso clã, e essa força é você. Você precisa se inscrever agora para que os deuses do algoritmo não te façam perder nossas próximas lendas exclusivas. Este é o momento de mostrar seu valor. Esmague o botão de like para alimentar nossa fogueira e inunde os comentários com suas reações sobre este final. Suas teorias são o ouro do nosso tesouro. E o mais importante, compartilhe instantaneamente este vídeo com pelo menos 5 amigos que precisam conhecer este desfecho. Apenas os verdadeiros guerreiros do nosso clã entendem a importância destas ações. Não espere nem mais um segundo.